Our guest today is Dr. Justin Richardson, who is an assistant professor of geosciences at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. His research focuses on forest soils and how humans alter the physical, chemical, and biological nature of forests. His current research focuses on nutrient cycling in perturbed soils, toxic metal transport in New England watersheds, and urban forests. Dr. Richardson is a Southern California native and completed a Bachelor of Science in Soil Science at the University of California, Riverside. And he moved to New England and completed his PhD in Earth Sciences on lead and mercury pollution at Dartmouth College in 2015. After a postdoctoral fellowship at Cornell University, he joined the UMass Amherst faculty in 2018, and we are very lucky to have him and his knowledge here in the Valley. So, Justin, I will turn it over to you.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks for having me and inviting me. I'm always happy to talk about soils to anyone who's willing to listen. So today I'm going to be covering invasive earthworms in New England, specifically their forests, and investigate and discuss some of the damage they do to the ecosystems and how do they spread and what we could do to prevent them from spreading further. So this was a talk that was completed with collaboration from Joseph Goris at the University of Vermont. So I didn't do all this by myself. Okay, so to start the presentation, I was instructed to ask a good question. And the most basic question to ask is, what do you guys know about earthworms? So I'd just like to open it up to the floor, and if anyone wants to chime in and let me know, or let the group know, what do you guys know about earthworms?
We have a comment in the chat that they are in my garden and are good for my garden with a question mark.
That's an excellent point. Is that yeah, they are present in gardens, and they can be good for some plants, and as I'll talk about, they could be bad for some other plants.
Someone said they are good bait for fishing.
Yes, so some of them are good for fishing. That's absolutely correct. I'm going to be talking about some Faridamoid earthworms, and they actually are not that great as bait. But everyone typically uses the nightcrawler, or Lumbricus terrestris. Any other earthworm exposure?
Somebody said that they use red wigglers for recycling compost.
Ah, yes, red wrigglers, which are the Icenia fetida. Yeah, so that's a very good one for composting and eating organic matter. They really like acid soils, and they are very voracious, and they reproduce pretty quickly. So that's an excellent interaction with earthworms.
And we have one more comment that they are a food source for birds and other animals.
Exactly. So they are, what other organism that's an animal eats soil? There's very few. So that means that they are able to be widely abundant, and they can be a foundational block for ecosystems. So great point, yeah. And I'll talk about that as well. So any other interactions? So that's pretty much the majority of interactions. They're in your soils and gardens. They're used as bait, and you can use them for composting. So pretty much nailed my next slide. So earthworms in everyday world is that there's a crush of worms every spring. So you'll often see after the first major spring, after the soils thaw, that the earthworms come up. You can't blame them. They've been trapped in a hole for 4 months out of the year. They're commonly used as fishing bait. So the Lumbricus terrestris, which literally translate in Latin to worm of the earth, they're used commonly as bait. They like to wriggle, and that attracts fish. And then also they're used in compost. So that's the Icenia fetida, which is a earthworm that does really well in really organic acid soils. They thrive there, and they're able to decompose the organic matter. So those are the typical ways that earthworms, most people interact with earthworms. It sounds like everyone got all of those, so bonus points to everyone on that. So the earthworm. The earthworm actually has a lot of interesting anatomical features to it. So earthworms are part of the annelid family in taxonomy. So they are segmented, so there's different segments on the worms, and they actually have their own organs. So it might be a little tough to see here, but starting from the right of the diagram to the left is that there's actually a mouth, and they have hearts. They have 4 to 5 hearts. They have a set of both male and female reproductive organs, so they can lay eggs without having to interact with other earthworms, or they can exchange DNA through reproduction. They have gizzards to help crush and use the soil material to start degrading the organic matter. They have a clitellum, which is once an earthworm becomes an adult, they actually get this band on them, and that's called the clitellum. It's also frequently the host of the reproductive organs. And then the rest of the earthworm is actually just part of the digestive tract. So it's a set of intestines and other things that function essentially as a stomach or intestines to absorb nutrients from the soils. So contrary to the knowledge you learn as a child, if you cut an earthworm in half, they will not grow into 2 earthworms. But unfortunately, one part will have all the heart and the other part will not have the heart, so thus it can't live. So earthworms are omnivores and detritivores, meaning that they get their sustenance from eating the soil. So that could be the dead organic matter, or it can actually be the fungi and bacteria that are alive in soil. So they are this interesting branch between detritivores and omnivores. And they eat soil organic matter, and they also feed on the microscopic biota. So frequently they can also eat the fungi. There's over 3,000 species of earthworms worldwide. They can range from smaller than your pinky to actually larger than snakes. I think the largest one in the world is almost 3 feet long. So there are some very large earthworms out there. And what's interesting with earthworms is that there's not a lot of energy or sugars in soils. So they have to eat a lot of their food to be able to get enough energy. So they can ingest 2 to 30 times their own body weight in soil every day to maintain metabolism. So they eat a lot of soil. And like I mentioned, if you cut an earthworm in half, it unfortunately will kill it. It won't turn into 2 separate earthworms. Okay, so here in New England is that earthworms have largely been wiped out due to the Laurentide ice sheet, which is 22,000 years ago. My apology, I'm missing a 0 on there. And because of the Laurentide ice sheet that occurred 22,000 years ago, it pushed all the soil into the Atlantic Ocean or formed Cape Cod, and also pushed all the material down to Long Island. So there's no soil in New England and no organisms that survived it from the Laurentide ice sheet 22,000 years ago. So earthworms have been slowly journeying back up northward. So the glaciers pushed down to Pennsylvania and New Jersey. And that means that earthworms can only crawl so much. Even if they were to be picked up by a bird and inadvertently dropped, they have a very slow spreading rate of less than a kilometer for 100 years. So less than half a mile, essentially every year. So they can't crawl back here. But as you note, that they're in your garden, and that they can be found throughout Massachusetts and Connecticut and all through Vermont and New Hampshire. So how did the earthworms get here if they were wiped out during the last major glaciation? And it's a little, I'll get to it in a second. But essentially, because the earthworms were wiped out from this region, the forests of New England have largely developed without earthworms. If you go over to Scandinavia or Europe or even China, the forests in those regions, they have native earthworms, and the soils have developed looking and behaving with earthworms. But New England forests are quite special. They did not have earthworms, so we have a very thick organic horizon, a very thick forest floor, and that allows for a lot of understory plants. But the first set of earthworms came from European settlers. So it's one of the gifts that came along with the Mayflower is that they actually used soils to help weigh down their boats. So after they came to the New World, they brought earthworms first off, and they also released earthworms with the soil that they scooped out of their boats to help weigh it down. So really the first set of gifts of earthworms are from European settlers back in the 1600s, 1700s. So the first set of earthworms that they brought was actually a very diverse group of earthworms that I'll mention. And they have different functions in the ecosystems. So roughly there's 4 different types of earthworms. There are the epigeics, so epi meaning up, and jeic is where they live and do their business. And these are very small earthworms typically. They are litter feeders. They live in the duff or the forest floor. They're frequently pigmented because they need to be able to survive ultraviolet radiation, and they're very small, and they don't make permanent burrows. The next type of earthworms are the endogeics. So the endogeics are mineral feeding earthworms. They live their entire life in the mineral soil, and they do not come up to the surface. So we rarely see them, and if you want to see them, you need to dig at least 6 inches down, up to 3-4 feet that you can find the endogeics. And then the last type, we have the Anisic earthworms. And the Anisic earthworms are like the Lumbricus terrestris. They make big permanent burrows that they go up and down in the soil that can actually extend 4 or 5 feet deep. And the Anisic earthworms come up to the surface, they find their food, and then they crawl back into their burrows. So they oftentimes have pretty extensive vertical burrows, and these are the larger type of earthworms. Arguably, there is a 4th type of ecophysiological type of earthworm, which is the epiendogeic, meaning that they spend some of their time in the forest floor, and then some of the time they live in the mineral soil. So it's a combination between the epi and the endogeic earthworms. All right, so let's take a peek at some of these. So here is the standard nightcrawler or Canadian nightcrawler, the Lumbricus terrestris. It's the most commonly used earthworm for fishing. They can be pretty long, up to 13 centimeters. So that's about, 6 inches in length. Yeah, I think I saw a comment or question, Brianne.
Oh, yep, we have a question. What is the taxonomic name of the native earthworm, and what does it look like?
So we don't have any native to New England. They've all been wiped out. There are some Lumbricus down in let's say like Virginia and Maryland. There are some native earthworms. Unfortunately, I can't name it off the top of my head. But the ones that we have here, we have like Lumbricus terrestris, which is the Anisic earthworm. And there are some Lumbricus that are native, but the terrestris is one from Europe. So we have some other types of earthworms like the Epigenetic Earthworm, like the Dendrobina octaedra, which is a very small earthworm. This is just blown up very large, but it's about 2 inches in length. So it's a very small earthworm. Sometimes you see them used as fishing bait, sometimes you use them for vermicomposting. But typically your Lumbricus terrestris, or the earthworm, or worm of the earth, that is a common bait used. Next one is the last of the main groups is the endogeics. So you often won't see them because they live in the mineral soil for the most of their lives, but they typically don't have a robust dark red color. They're very grayish in color. So this one is the Aprechtidea rosea type earthworm. So it's also commonly known as a gray worm. It's pretty gray, but it's got a pink nose, hence its name. You see these in gardens and forests now. And then their adult length is about 6 centimeters. So they're like 3 inches, but you can see them up to 5 inches. But there are soil dwellers and soil feeders. So this is just kind of getting a nice little overview of some of the types of earthworms that we have here. And they were all brought by European settlers. So we have a couple families. We have the Dendrobina, we have the Aprechtidea, and then we have the Lumbricus. Those are all ones that came over starting with the Mayflower. All right. So earthworms, they are often called soil engineers. And that's because of their ability to make burrows and turn soils over and mix soils. So the Anisic earthworms, even though they mix soils, they actually are they like to eat leaves. So here's actually a really cool zoom in on the earthworm actually picking up the leaf by the petiole and then bringing it into the hole. Charles Darwin, his last major work, The Formation of Vegetable Mold, in 1883, was all about Lumbricus terrestris and other earthworms. And he actually observed that no matter which way you present the leaf to the Lumbricus terrestris, it will always find where the stem is, or the petiole, and bring it into its burrow using that. Probably because that's the easiest way to grab it with his mouth. And then when you have endogenic earthworms, they consume and mix the soil because they don't really live in a permanent burrow. So they're always constantly turning and eating and depositing soils in different layers. So you get a lot of mixing of soils through these endogenic earthworms. Now, because of these actions of mixing soils and making permanent burrows, they have a profound effect on what soils look like. And soils are my expertise. That's how I got into earthworms. I never really studied earthworm biology until I was doing my PhD in soils, and then all of a sudden I had to learn about earthworms. So on the left, we're looking at a soil profile with no earthworms, and on the right, we're looking at a soil profile with earthworms present. This is a ruler with a 10 centimeter scale color alternating, so you can kind of get a grasp of it. So about 3 of these is about a foot, so they're not very large. 3 of these bands is about a foot. So what you can see here is that we have different horizons and different layers in the soils, and they look very different between the two profiles. And the difference is that we actually have smaller organic horizons between the two soils. Beneath that, we actually have deeper A horizons with the earthworms present. And then lastly, we have fewer soil horizons when you have earthworms present. So I'm not sure how much soil science everyone's gotten, so I'll just walk through some of these profiles. On the left, we have this thick organic horizon, and the organic horizon are just dead leaves and roots, branches, woody materials that have been deposited from trees, and they just decompose through time. Here on the right, though, we do not have an organic horizon. The earthworms have consumed all the leaf litter, and we just see the A horizon at the surface. And the A horizon is where organic matter accumulates, but it's predominantly mineral soil. So in the left profile, we actually don't really have a very large A horizon. We have a very thin A horizon. But on the earthworm invaded soil, we have a very thick A horizon. On the left, we also have a very deep B horizon. And here we have a very weakly developed B horizon. So when you have earthworms present, they disturb what the soil looks like and the different materials and how they're distributed with depth. So with earthworms, we have a nice mixing of organic horizon in the mineral soil. But without earthworms, we have a nice organic horizon that forms, or forest floor, and we have a very thin A horizon, and then we have a very well-developed B horizon. So there's this interesting play where if you have earthworms, they start mixing the soil and you lose your horizons. But when you don't have earthworms, the horizons are able to form what would normally happen or typically happen without them present. Feel free to stop me if you have any questions, or drop it in the chat, or unmute yourself if you wish to ask any questions. I'm just going to go through this as slowly as possible. All right. So European earthworms have been present, as I mentioned, since the 1600s, since European settlers came and deposited their soils and brought their animals and sheep and hay that they had brought over and deposited. But the newest issue are the Asiatic Faridamoid earthworms, and these are what are often considered the worst invaders. I think I had a comment.
Yeah, we had a comment about the soil horizons. What is the significance of them?
Fantastic question. So why do different horizons matter? They can matter for different reasons. For plants, having a nice A horizon can be very beneficial for more established plants, but some plants actually need the organic horizon to actually germinate. So if you have no organic horizon, it makes it tougher for plants to germinate, or understory plants. And I'll get into that in a little bit. But also organic horizons are nice spongy materials that can hold on to, say, pollutants. That's one reason I was very interested in soils and organic horizons. So if you lose the organic horizon, then you lose some of your ability to hold on to, say, pollutants in soils. So yeah, they have different roles. If you're like thinking about it like I'm at the ecosystem level, if you're thinking about contaminants, or if you're thinking about gardens, or if you're thinking about forest health, there's trade-offs between the different horizons. So there's no such thing as a bad soil. There's just, they're bad for certain things. Okay, so more recently, we're very interested in these Asiatic Faridamoid earthworms. They've been proven to be very hardy invaders. So if you have a chance, you can go read this article titled Cancel Earthworms by Julia Rawson, which was in The Atlantic this year. And it really did an excellent job profiling me and several other colleagues on these crazy earthworms and what do they do to both garden soils and forest soils. Unfortunately, I had like the worst quote ever. I told a very long story to the reporter, and I think she only put a quote in that is like, "Oh, earthworms are gross for me," which is true. I really don't like touching earthworms. They're very slimy and mucousy, but I said a lot more than I promised. Okay. So what are these Faridamoid earthworms? Well, these Faridamoids, they've been nicknamed the crazy snakeworm. And that's because they actually move like a snake. So the Lumbricus terrestris is kind of flaccid and it moves by extension and compression of its segments. But the Faridamoids are actually, they have a high body static pressure. So they actually feel more like a tube or a snake rather than like a sock, for example, like most earthworms do. So they actually are able to slither and move away from their predators quite rapidly, rather than the Lumbricus terrestris that has to slink along the ground. The Fredomoids are voracious eaters. They're epiendogenic, meaning that they'll eat mineral soil if they need to, but they will happily eat decomposing leaves. And you'll actually find them in tree stumps. They can actually eat the wood on trees, or the fungi that are eating the wood. They'll eat that as well. So they're very voracious feeders, and they can feed on lots of different types of materials. Unlike the Lumbricus terrestris, they are actually an annual earthworm. So they actually hatch from eggs in spring and die in the winter. So they only live for less than a year, while Lumbricus terrestris can live several years because they can burrow deep enough to not freeze. As I mentioned, earthworms are frequently parthenogenic. So this is actually a very prolific parthenogenic earthworm, which means that they can self-fertilize their own eggs and release eggs throughout the year that they're growing. And they're so voracious and invasive that several states have actually made it illegal to own and propagate these Faridamoid earthworms. So I know New York State, Wisconsin, I want to say Michigan as well, but I'm not sure if Massachusetts has yet prohibited an earthworm from being, sold and propagated, but it should be definitely considered in this case. So the Fredomoids really come in three major flavors here. We have the Metaphyre hilgendorfi, which is a very large earthworm. It's just 4 to 7 inches, so it almost looks like a snake. It's very gross. Every time I see them on the ground, it's quite scary. The center one we have Amynthas agrestis, which is 3 to 6 years. I mean, its name is agrestis. It's a quite aggressive earthworm and will slink along like a snake on the surface of the soils. And then on the right, we have Amynthas tokianosis, which is 1 to 5 inches in length. So you can see that they range in different sizes when they reach adulthood, depending on their availability of food and how happy they are in their ecosystem. I've definitely seen a Metaphyre hilgendorfi almost 10 inches long. It's very gross, very slimy too. So in the Metaphyre life cycle is that they lay eggs during the growing season. So from July all the way till, say, July, November, down to November, they lay eggs. So the eggs are these little cocoons. You'll actually see them actually develop in the earthworm, and then they release them into the soil, and they slowly hatch. So you can see the different stages at which they hatch, and then they can grow into adults. So here's a hatchling, and then you have juveniles, and only once they get their clitellum are they an adult, and they are able to release their eggs. But you can have them developing quite rapidly. By late June, you have adults. So they can hatch in April and be adults by July. So very rapid growth cycle. Any questions? We're all good? Yes, earthworms actually come from eggs.
Oh yeah, we have a question in the chat. How big are the cocoons?
Yes, so the cocoons are actually quite small. They are on like the 2 to 4 millimeter range. So maybe 3/8 of an inch, 1/4 of an inch. So they're pretty small.
Great, thank you. I actually had a question too, if you didn't mind.
Yeah.
So we had a presenter who was talking about birds and other wildlife in New England a couple weeks ago. It just made me think, are these worms things that we could visually identify, or do they need to be sort of scientifically analyzed? Like if we saw a worm in our yard, would we be able to visually identify it based on a photo?
Well, you can absolutely identify the Faridamoids. So that's an excellent question. Can you identify these at home? And I think you can definitely identify a Faridamoid because it will move like a snake. If you touch it with anything like a stick or even your finger and it moves like a snake, it is absolutely a Faridamoid. The Lumbricus, the Epigenetic, the Dendrobinas, Thyssina fetidas, no other earthworm has that very high hydrostatic body pressure to be able to undulate like a snake. So if you touch it and it wriggles like a snake, it is the snakeworm for sure. But which one, that takes a little bit of some more training to be able to identify. And actually, you can actually identify several other Lumbricus, Lumbricus terrestris and Lumbricus rubellus. If you give it a nice little stroke on its back, it's known as a shovel tail. So it actually will flatten its tail. And if it flattens its tail and looks like a shovel, then that's actually a good way to identify it as a Lumbricus earthworm.
Great, thank you so much.
Yeah. Let's see. Great. So through its life cycle, there's lots of eggs that can make it through the winters. So these Faridamoids they're native to Asia, where it does get freezing throughout the year. So even though it can be very cold in January and February, where it can get easily down into the single-digit temperatures, for a couple of days, that's actually not enough to kill these earthworms. They can actually survive throughout the year. So you can see that the cocoons are quite viable throughout the entire year. All right, so the Faridamoids they are native to Japan and Korea. This is where they are originally identified. So they've, they didn't come for a while, and it's postulated that there's several reasons that they were able to make the trans-Pacific journey to the United States. There's some folklore that some of the first Faridamoids actually came with tree gifts of cherry blossoms in Washington, D.C. from Japan. That's been a hypothesis. But most likely they came just through regular horticultural trade, much like, say, the American chestnut blight. There's lots of things that have come from Asia for the past couple hundred years and have left an indelible mark on the forests of the Northeast. So international trade of horticultural plants has been a very important transport of, say, earthworms. Arboretums and gardens, once they get established from getting a rare species, say from Japan, then they easily can get transferred across arboretums. And these species, the Faridamoids, do really well in disturbed soils, which are frequently found in arboretums and gardens. Anytime you have turning over and remixing of pots, it's been shown that these earthworms do really well in that, those conditions. And then lastly, people collect and transport plant materials. So let's say that one yard has these Faridamoids. They go into the litter, and then they get transported to a main system where they do some composting, but it's not enough to kill the cocoons. Then they can get transported and used elsewhere for mulch, and they can get transported again and again. So these earthworms are very opportunistic and can be found everywhere. They're throughout Holyoke. I've seen them there. I've seen them throughout the Holyoke mountain range. I'm over in Hadley and Amherst, and I see them all there on the UMass campus. So they're very prevalent and have been transported widely throughout the United States. Here is a nice map that was put together by Jean-David Moore up in Quebec, and they've done the study looking at where earthworms have been found throughout the eastern United States. So they've been found all throughout Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, all across Massachusetts. They're all through Connecticut, Rhode Island. Over in the Finger Lakes, they were on the Cornell campus. They're all throughout the Finger Lakes. They're all throughout Syracuse. Down across New York City, they're very prevalent. They're all throughout the Northeast, to say the least. And they've already, they have a wide range all the way from Florida to Minnesota up to Maine. So you can see that they are just everywhere. Any questions? A little doom and gloom there. Great. Oh, there's a question.
Yeah, the question was about the yellow dots on the map, what they represent.
Oh man, it's not on here. Okay, the yellow dots, great question. The yellow dots are actually some field study sites that have been established to look at how do they transport and move throughout the invasion. So great question. I thought I had that. There was actually a yellow dot there, but it's not present. Okay, so why do we care about Fredomoids in particular? As I mentioned, Lumbricus terrestris has been here for over 400 years, or almost over 300 years. Apraectidia and Dendrobina have also been prevalent throughout New England for several hundred years. So why do we now really care about these specific earthworms? What are their impacts on native understory plants? And what I'm very interested in is their bioaccumulation of toxic metals. So I'm going to go through these 3 little vignettes to describe why they are of such interest to myself and several other scientists. This is a picture of my collaborator, Dr. Joseph Goris, during one of our first earthworm excursions at a wildlife sanctuary where they are very prevalent. All right. So the main reason one of the first main reasons that we care about Fredomoids is that they're very large and in charge earthworms. So during my PhD, I conducted the study at 45 forest stands throughout 9 sites across Vermont, New Hampshire. And at each of these sites, I dug a half meter by half meter soil pit and hand sorted all the soil for earthworms. A little bit backbreaking work, but it's a labor of love to execute. And got some awesome pictures, got to check out lots of really cool soils throughout Vermont, New Hampshire. And I dug them down until I couldn't dig anymore. So there's actually a boulder at the bottom of this soil pit. And what we found was that you can have some pretty high density of earthworms. So the Amynthas agrestis is one of the Fredomoids. There's on average 60 individuals per meter squared. But that was a wide range because you find them in invasion waves. So if you look at the beginning of a wave, there's very few earthworms. If you see at the the big crest, there's a high abundance of earthworms, over 100 individuals per meter squared. And eventually they taper off after they eat all the good food, and you then see the population stabilize lower. But typically they have more individuals per meter squared than most other earthworms. So our Apraectidia rosea, Apraectidia tuberculata, those are our endogenic earthworms. They occur in similar numbers of individuals. Dendrobina octaedra have a huge variation, but these are very small earthworms. And then we have Lumbricus rubellus and Lumbricus terrestris. Lubricus rubellus, that's our redworm. You frequently see them used as trout bait. And then we have Lubricus terrestris, which is our classic Canadian nightcrawler. And then we also have this other fun one, Octalasian cyanium, which is another European earthworm. So you can see that some of the larger earthworms are in lower abundance. But when you actually scale it by the sheer mass of the earthworms, it's very clear that the Amynthas agrestis is by far a larger earthworm and has more individuals per meter squared. So if you were to take all of the earthworms in a square meter and dry them out, there's actually more mass of them than all the other earthworms. So it's a very large and in charge type of earthworm.
We have a question in the chat. Do the Faridamoids have predators that eat them?
So I'm not gonna, I guess I'll cover it a little bit, but as an epiendogenic earthworm, they do hang out at the surface, and if they if there's any ground foraging bird that will turn over a leaf, they can easily find them. But the Fredomoids actually are, they're warriors. They are really meant to survive. They actually have this ability to abscise their tails. So they actually will lose the last, say, 15 segments of their digestive tract, and it flails, and the rest of the earthworm is actually able to slink off and grow new tail. So they can actually escape predators by sacrificing their tail. Yeah, it's a very powerful thing. So let's see. I guess sorry, I'll show the picture here, just since someone asked about it. So do you see on this Metaphyre hilgendorfi, you can see some pinching on the ends of the tail? That's actually it getting ready to abscise its tail so that the tail will wiggle and then it's able to slink off and survive. So that's yeah, you can see actually the tail pinching off. So they have lots of mechanisms to help survive. They're very voracious eaters. They can eat lots of things, and they can even help fight and run away from predators by releasing their tail. Cool. Great question. Appreciate it. Okay. Great. So yeah, so there's a high abundance and they're very large earthworms. So they're very large and in charge earthworms when it comes to eating and destroying the forests and their soils. One of the main issues that we're worried about in terms of their impacts is that they can dramatically reduce the diversity of understory plants. So on the left is a picture with no earthworms. So we have, multi-layered forests with lots of understory. We have shrubs growing. We have young trees sprouting. But on the right, we can see that there's very few saplings and very few understory plants. It becomes almost naked. And the issue with that is that they are able to eat the entire forest floor. The forest floor is a very important layer for germinating plants. So understory plants really struggle to be able to take hold when you have these Fredomoids invading the forests. Yeah, they have very stark contrasts in the forests due to their abundance and invasion. So one vignette from my collaborator, Dr. Anise Dobson, who's now at Yale in their biology department. We did this study where we were looking at a couple understory plants. We looked at Christmas ferns and false Solomon seals, and we're looking at do Fredomoids decrease their ability to survive. So this study was completed in 2017 and was published in the journal Plant and Soil. And when you have typical soils without earthworms, you have this organic horizon, you have an A horizon, and frequently you have a B horizon. And the plants, when they first get established, they establish roots both in the organic horizon and they establish roots in the A horizon. And what we found is that there's a tight nutrient cycling where plants are able to take up nutrients, they release it back to the soils as their leaves die, and they're able to take more nutrients back up. So there's really a tight nutrient cycle in typical forests for understory plants. But once you have the invasion of the Faridamoids, we lose the organic horizon. And by losing the organic horizon, we have a couple things start occurring, is that you have a buildup of nutrients from earthworms eating the organic horizon and releasing them as soluble nutrients back into the A horizon. We see that plants then need to try and root deeper to be able to access nutrients, and they're not able to really utilize a lot of these readily exchangeable nutrients in the A horizon. Because you have to think that they grew up in the O horizon and then they rooted in the A horizon, really more for moisture purposes. But because we have this shift in where nutrients are no longer in the organic horizons, they're in the A horizons, the plants really struggle to be able to take up nutrients. So we actually were able to observe nutrient deficiencies in native plants once you have the establishment of the Faridamoids. So Christmas ferns and false Solomon seals and some other plants actually decreased. They had decreases in their nutrient contents of their leaves. And what's interesting here is that if you have high abundance of nutrients in the A horizon, that allows for invasive plants to colonize. So things like the garlic mustard can easily take root in the soils. So there's a question earlier, or like an idea earlier, are earthworms good for plants? So if you have a plant that's able to really access and utilize these exchangeable nutrients, bam, it's really, they actually really help plants access nutrients. But if these plants are not, physiologically ready to access nutrients quite rapidly from the soils, then they actually become nutrient losers. So these Fredomoids can really boost some plants and their ability to grow, but for native plants, they actually they do a disservice. So any questions on that point? Yeah, it's a busy diagram, so I slowly unleashed it.
Yeah, one question. So these worms are native to Japan. Are the plants that grow natively in Japan better able to tolerate the worms in their presence, or are they also harmful to the soil and plants there?
Excellent question. So because they are from Japan, the ecosystems are actually very adapted. So you don't see, they're actually not super common in the forests of Japan from what I've heard. Essentially, there are either pathogens, that kill them, or there's lots of predators that are able to eat them. But in Japan, they are just like you see them, but they're not in these huge droves and big invasion waves that we see here in the United States. So excellent question. So lastly, I'm interested personally, I'm interested in the first 2 points, but I'm very interested in the metals. So as a biogeochemist, which is a fancy word to say how elements move from rocks and soils into plants and animals, I'm always curious about toxic elements getting into trees and plants and animals. So using the same study from Vermont and New Hampshire, I actually found very high concentrations of mercury in actually most of the earthworms. And that's because we have lots of mercury being deposited both regionally from all the coal combustors in Pennsylvania and Ohio. We also have lots of lots of mercury being deposited in forests from China and beyond the United States and coal combustion. And that all releases mercury into the environment. And mercury then gets accumulated into soils. And soils holding on to mercury is actually a very good thing. It prevents the mercury from moving into aquatic ecosystems. But here with these exotic and invasive earthworms, they actually then eat and bioaccumulate that mercury, which would have just stayed in the soil. So if there's any birds that were eating these earthworms that have these high concentrations of mercury, it could potentially be toxic to them. So say like the Bicknell thrush or even the American robins, any bird that is a ground foraging bird that can then find earthworms, which they are able to do, it could be toxic to their ability to reproduce and thrive. And so that was actually in the rural forests of Vermont and New Hampshire. We actually can see similar things in more urban areas. So one study site I examined was Poughkeepsie, New York. So if you've ever heard of Vassar College, I sampled all around the campus and throughout the city. And I went to 28 urban forests. And in the urban forests, I was able to find that earthworms had actually accumulated, specifically the Faridamoid earthworms had accumulated cadmium and lead at potentially toxic concentrations in their tissues. So not only do you have to worry about earthworms transferring mercury into the birds, but there's also the transfer of cadmium and lead in more urbanized areas. So that's something that scientists haven't really done. Unfortunately, earthworm scientists and birders haven't really done enough communication. I actually reached out to the Ottoman Society of Connecticut, and they never responded back with my emails, which is very unfortunate. So it's not that I'm not trying, like I've tried, they just have not responded back to me. But I've been very interested to see, does this pose actually a potential hazard to some of our ground foraging birds throughout the region? Yep, so cadmium, which is CD, and then lead. Those were all concentrations that have been shown to be toxic to birds and mammals at that concentration. Okay, there's a question.
Sure. So the question is, so our landfill and dumping is filtering into the earthworms?
So if I can get that correctly, is landfills and illegal dumping getting into earthworms?
I think the question was how the sort of the cadmium and lead are getting into the soil for the earthworm to consume.
Okay, yeah, excellent question. So cadmium exists in many things. And so cadmium, chromium, cobalt, copper, nickel, and lead, those are all things that come off of the dust whenever you use your brake pads release metals into the environment. Lead was in leaded gasoline, lead was in paint, nickel and copper have been emitted through manufacturing and smelting. So any industrial process in urban areas have released metals into the soil. So it doesn't even have to be a waste dump or toxic dump. They are just in the soils ambiently. Like in the study that I completed, these were all just forests between baseball fields or behind houses, between the police station, the fire department. These are not toxic waste dumps. These are just urban forests. So nothing special there. Great question. So how do the Fredomoids keep, expanding their range? And unfortunately, there's this cycle where, people want to recycle and reuse materials. It's absolutely part of being an efficient society. But by recirculating materials of mulches and giving them away to private and public entities, then you start transferring them to community gardens. They get spread to home gardens, and unfortunately, they can escape from landscaping and enter nearby forests. So they're very prolific and very good at expanding the range. So unless we're able to really get a grasp on how are we moving these materials, we're going to keep expanding their range into gardens and landscaping and even nearby forests. So what can we do? There is no magic hammer to get rid of earthworms from all the forests. First off, for gardeners and professionals, you should avoid using leaf mulch from other yards. You want to avoid using mulch and spreading mulch from municipal sources because you don't know where they came from, and you don't want to introduce it to your forest or even your garden unless you are sure of the source. You don't want to bring or buy and use wood mulches unless you know where they're coming from or you make it yourself. It's also really beneficial to make your own compost, on site or at your home. It just helps you, close your energy loop and also prevents the spread of the earthworms. Let's see. If you do want to trade plants, see if you can, shake off all the soil off of the roots and replant, which I know is really bad. Unless you have a very, very healthy root ball, this could absolutely nuke your plants. But it's an idea, And then lastly, if you can compost, if you do composting correctly, you can potentially kill cocoons because it can get too hot for them. So organically treated composts have been pretty successful in preventing their spread. So unfortunately, there's no approved pesticides for getting rid of earthworms. So unfortunately, little can be done once you get them. Manual removal slows them down ever so slightly, but they're very prolific breeders and they can dig into the soil pretty deep. So it's unfortunately, manual removal is not really a solution. Fortunately, there are some fungi and native parasites that have been shown to be able to kill them. So hopefully that will then, increase those populations. There's also soap-like substances that are derived from plants that can kill, that can potentially kill them. Solarization of your compost and composting correctly can really help prevent their spread. And there's been some talk about using the compound 7, but 7 really kills all the microbes and other other organisms in your soil. So you really don't want to use that. Yeah. But beside that, I mean, for your gardens, these earthworms could be very beneficial for you to be able to grow plants, but they're not good for forests. So, you got to weigh the things. But if you can avoid having them in your garden, you should. Yeah, those are the main takeaways. So with that, I'm very appreciative of you listening to my blabbing, and I'd love to just sit and converse with you all.
Thank you so much. All right.
That was wonderful. As I learned something that I can apply to my gardening. We have the town of Granby has a municipal shredder mulcher thing. So that who knows where all that material is coming from. I will not be using that now.
That's the unfortunate part. Potentially, if you can compost it yourself and cook it, it might be fine. But yeah, that can spread earthworms. But also, if you're applying it to your garden and you're not near a forest, at this point, they're probably already in your yard, but you don't know it. They actually leave a very specific calling card. They make I'll see if I can find a picture of it, but they essentially make it almost looks like rice, but it's soil. They really change what the soil looks like, and it's very easy to identify them as being present without even digging. I'll see if I can dig up a picture real quick.
All right. So if anyone has a question, we're a fairly small group, so it's fine for you to just unmute and ask your question out loud.
Hello. Yes, my question is, are the native worms good for our gardens and our lawns and so forth? Or do they have bad features also?
Let's see. So the native earthworms of eastern United States are really for forested regions. So if you're looking for them to really enhance the growth of your plants, they probably won't do it. European earthworms might be more beneficial, but they're not really. Let's say. I guess my point is that it depends on what you're growing. The native species are really they evolve for forested ecosystems. So if they're not really meant for gardens, but they could potentially benefit some plants. I don't think it's worth spending money to add earthworms to your garden. Like Lubricus terrestris is not going to benefit your garden. It's an interesting question, and it's kind of like, what is the specific goal? Yeah. So I hope that ramble helped.
Not to monopolize this, but I've always heard that earthworms were good in that as they did the things you said they do, they go through the soil and they bring the soil through their body and so forth, and they make these tunnels and all, and that way the water and the nutrients can get down into the soil down below and can mix it, and it's all a positive thing, but that's not necessarily correct, right?
That's unfortunate. Yeah, you're absolutely correct. It's at the most basic level, there are a lot of truths to that, But what we've actually found is that the Lumbricus terrestris can actually make burrows that allow fertilizers to go very deep and out of the plant rooting zone quickly. So that's actually been pretty negative impact ecosystem-wise. But they do perturb the soil, and that does allow for roots to take hold easier. So if the plants are abundant and able to access those nutrients that are released, then it's going to absolutely help them grow. But if they're more like a native species or a woody species, then it could potentially have a negative impact. I found a nice picture of what the soil looks like. So this is what the soil looks like when you have the Faridamoids. They actually make a nice, very grainy type of soil. So if you ever see this at the surface of your soils in your gardens, then you definitely have them present. No, I don't say no other earthworm, but most earthworms do not make this type of mound with these very pellet-like soils.
So some fishermen aren't supposed to dump their worms.
That's correct.
Is this because they are not night crawlers? That these Fredomoids are being sold for fishing worms?
So fortunately, the Fredomoids are not very good for being used as bait, so they're not commonly sold. So like I mentioned, they have a hydrostatic body pressure, so they feel more like, I don't know, like licorice or something than like kind of a sock, which is very limp. And the unfortunate part about the high body static pressure is when you go to put a hook in them, then they essentially start deflating and they lose all their juices and they turn into, so they're not very good bait to use. I've used them for bait and they're not very good.
We do have a question in the chat as well. How do the worms affect carbon sequestration in soils? Do they stimulate the release of carbon dioxide?
Was that Bob Newton that wrote that?
It was, yes.
Oh, Bob. Hi, Bob. Good question. So the organic horizon holds carbon, and the mineral soil also holds carbon. And when you start decomposing that material, you can release that as carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So the Faridamoids absolutely change the balance of carbon storage versus carbon release in soils. So you actually can get a net increase in carbon dioxide release from forest soils, from garden soils, that would have been stabilized in the soil otherwise. So so they actually act as a net decreaser of carbon storage in soils.
Could I put my hand up?
Yeah.
I think your point on these worms actually helping or instigating invasive species of plants is an issue that is really troublesome to me. I mean, we already have a huge problem with invasives invading the understory of our forests. So just a few of the major invasive species off the top of my head, like autumn olive, oriental bittersweet, redwing euonymus, the barberry, they're all native to China, Japan. So this is really troublesome to me, that these species that we're already having an issue with are actually going to benefit from these worms.
Yes, some of those species that you rattle off, I absolutely, whenever I see those, I can find the worms in those soils. So it's absolutely some facultative action where once the earthworms take hold, they then shift the balance toward these other species. Yeah, garlic mustard is a big one. Yeah,
and that's a new one to, at least to my area. I live in Belchertown, and I just have been I found it off my property and in the swales on the roadsides. It's coming. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. That was an excellent point.
So I have a question about, you said the best way to prevent them is to just make sure you're being really careful about what you're putting in your garden. have there been any legal restrictions so far that have been enacted? I know you said a couple states have, but like what sort of legal restrictions are they on the soils? Are they on the worms specifically?
So the legal restrictions is primarily focused on people buying and selling them. So there was a big market for a little bit there for Alabama jumpers, which is another word for the Fredomoids. They've got lots of names: crazy snakeworm, Alabama jumpers, even though they're from Japan and Korea, not from Alabama. But yeah, so there was a market as they are really effective at decomposing stuff. So they were thought that potentially they could be used for compost. But the unfortunate part is that if you compost with Fredomoids present, they will actually eat the compost, and then you'll have to apply compost and mulch even faster.
Wow. All right. Well, thank you.
Are the red wigglers adding these egg cases to my garden when I put in that compost?
Great question. So do the red wigglers, aka where's the chat window? Let's see. I'll type in that. Let's see. Isenia fatiga. I believe that's, I might have misspelled that, but it's pretty much that. That's what they're typically. Those are your decomposers for like vermiculture. The Isenia fetida have actually a very specific desire and what they need. So when you add those to your garden soils, unless you have a very high organic matter content, they actually probably will die out, unfortunately. So you could potentially have them if you have very, pretty acidic, lots of organic matter in the soils, then they can take hold, but they might. Unlikely though.
I had a friend who was, she had a compost system with feeding worms under her sink, and she was like trying to eat more vegetables because she was trying to feed the worms all the time. Like they were growing and multiplying so quickly that she couldn't keep up with feeding them. So I get the idea that how much they eat and how much they go through. Yeah.
2 to 30 times their body weight per day.
Wow. Wow. So we're over our 3 o'clock, but anybody have any other last minute questions? Otherwise, we'll wrap things up. Thank you so much, Justin. This was really, really interesting. Learned a lot. Yeah. And so for the rest of the audience, we are recording this, and in a couple of weeks, I will have it up on our YouTube channel. So if you want to share this information, with friends, it's there for that. So thank you very much, Justin.
Thanks. So yeah, if you want to reach out to me, if you type in Justin and soil, I usually come up pretty quickly on Google. Yeah, if you have any questions on anything, my research spans everything from wineries and soils to forests and soils, heavy metals in the environment, basically anything that involves nutrients or element cycling in some kind of terrestrial system, I'm there. So thanks everyone for coming.
Great.